The small town of Maplewood, Ohio, was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names. It had a single diner that served breakfast all day, a park with rusty swings, and streets lined with trees whose leaves turned golden every fall. But beneath its quiet charm, tension simmered just below the surface. Over the past few months, protests had erupted in nearby cities over police misconduct, and whispers of anger and frustration had started to spread through Maplewood as well. One Thursday evening, Major Daniel Carter drove into town after spending the weekend visiting his parents. He was an African-American man in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp features softened by years of kindness. His military ID hung loosely around his neck, tucked under his casual shirt. Daniel wasn't thinking about anything unusual as he pulled into the gas station near the edge of town. He needed fuel for the long drive back to the base. As he stepped out of his car, Daniel noticed 3 police officers walking toward him. They wore their uniforms like armor, badges, glinting in the fading sunlight. The first officer, Frank Miller, was a burly man with a scowl permanently etched onto his face. Kyle Dawson, younger and wiry, followed closely behind, his hands resting on his belt. Laura Bennett brought up the rear, her expression unreadable, but her hand hovering near her holster. "Hey, you!" Frank barked, pointing at Daniel. "What are you doing here?" Daniel froze for a moment, surprised by the hostility in Frank's tone. He straightened up and replied calmly, "I'm just getting gas." Frank didn't seem satisfied. He strode closer, his boots thudding against the pavement. "Do you have any ID?" he demanded, his voice louder now. Daniel nodded and reached for the ID hanging around his neck. "I'm Major Daniel Carter," he said, holding it up so they could see. U.S. Army. Instead of acknowledging his rank or credentials, Frank snatched the ID from Daniel's hand. He squinted at it, then sneered. "Yeah, right. Like we're supposed to believe this is real." Kyle chuckled nervously, stepping forward. "You know, people like you shouldn't be flashing fake IDs around. What's your deal? Trying to impress someone?" Daniel frowned, confused and growing uneasy. "This isn't fake," he said firmly. "I'm a U.S. Army major. I've served 2 tours overseas. You can verify my information if you need to." Laura remained silent, but her hand moved to grip her gun. She raised it slightly, aiming it in Daniel's direction without saying a word. Her stance sent a chill down his spine. Frank smirked, clearly enjoying the power dynamic. "Oh, look at this guy," he said mockingly. "Thinks he's some big shot because he wears a uniform. Let me tell you something, your fancy title doesn't mean squat here." People at the gas station began to notice the commotion. A young mother refueling her minivan glanced over, clutching her toddler tightly. An elderly man sitting on a bench nearby watched with wide eyes, unsure whether to intervene. Someone pulled out a phone and started recording. Daniel kept his voice, steady despite the rising tension. "Officer, there's no reason for this. I'm not causing trouble. I'm just trying to get home." But Frank wasn't listening. He leaned in closer, his breath hot and sour. "You think you can come into our town and act all high and mighty? We don't need your kind around here." "My kind," Daniel repeated, his jaw tightening. "Are you seriously going to stand there and insult me while I'm minding my own business?" Kyle laughed, shaking his head. "Wow, listen to this guy. Thinks he's untouchable." By now, several bystanders were filming the scene. Phones captured every insult, every sneer, every threatening gesture. One teenager live-streamed the confrontation on social media, drawing hundreds of viewers within minutes. Comments flooded in, calling out the officer's behavior and demanding answers. Daniel tried once more to de-escalate the situation. "Look, I don't want any problems, just let me go and we can forget this ever happened." Frank ignored him, instead turning to Kyle and Laura. "See how these people always play the victim card? Always whining about fairness." Laura finally spoke, her voice cold and clipped. "Maybe he needs a reminder of who's in charge." Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Daniel felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. He had faced danger before, on battlefields far away, but this was different. This was personal. These officers weren't protecting anyone. They were using their authority to intimidate him. For a moment, no one moved. Then Frank stepped back, waving dismissively. "Fine, get out of here. But don't let me catch you pulling stunts like this again." Daniel didn't argue. He slipped back into his car, hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the officers watching him leave, their faces smug and unrepentant. That night, the video of the incident exploded online. People across the country watched in disbelief as the officers mocked and threatened a decorated U.S. Army major. Hashtags like "Dorask Justice for Major Carter" trended on Twitter, and news outlets scrambled to cover the story. Protesters gathered outside the Maplewood police station, holding signs that read "Respect our heroes" and "No justice, no peace." At home, Daniel sat in silence, replaying the events in his mind. Michelle, his wife, placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You did nothing wrong," she said softly. "They're the ones who should be ashamed." Daniel sighed, running a hand over his face. "It's not just about me," he murmured. "This happens to people every day. I never thought it would happen to me." Michelle nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "Then maybe it's time to do something about it." Though exhausted, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The officers' actions had ignited a firestorm, and he knew he couldn't stay silent. Little did he realize this moment would set off a chain of events that would change not only his life, but also the lives of countless others. The video of the confrontation at the gas station spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was everywhere: social media platforms, news websites, and even late-night talk shows. People couldn't stop talking about it. The sight of 3 police officers mocking and threatening a decorated U.S. Army major struck a nerve with viewers across the country. Comments poured in by the thousands, condemning the officers' behavior and calling for justice. In Maplewood, the reaction was immediate and intense. Protesters began gathering outside the police station early the next morning. They held signs that read, "Respect our heroes and accountability now." Some carried American flags, while others chanted slogans demanding change. The crowd grew larger as the day went on, drawing people from neighboring towns who wanted to show their support for Major Daniel Carter. Inside the police station, things were chaotic. Officers rushed around, trying to manage calls from angry citizens and fielding questions from reporters. Chief Alan Parks, a middle-aged man with thinning gray hair, looked visibly stressed as he addressed his team in the briefing room. "This is a mess," he muttered under his breath before turning to face the group. "We need to handle this carefully. The whole world is watching." Frank Miller, Kyle Dawson, and Laura Bennett sat quietly in the corner, avoiding eye contact with their colleagues. None of them seemed remorseful about what had happened. Frank clenched his fists, muttering something about how the public didn't understand the pressures of being a cop. Kyle stared blankly at the floor, while Laura kept her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression unreadable. Meanwhile, Daniel found himself thrust into the spotlight. Reporters camped outside his house, hoping to get an interview. Friends and strangers alike reached out to offer words of encouragement or ask if they could help. While Michelle tried to shield him from the attention, Daniel knew he couldn't ignore it forever. He felt torn between wanting to move past the incident and knowing that speaking up might make a difference. One evening, after another long day of dealing with messages and phone calls, Daniel sat down with Michelle in their living room. "I don't want this to define me," he said, rubbing his temples. "But I also can't pretend it didn't happen." Michelle nodded, understanding the weight of his decision. "You've always stood up for what's right," she reminded him gently. "If anyone can turn this into something positive, it's you." After some thought, Daniel agreed to give an interview. He chose a local news station known for its balanced reporting, hoping to tell his story without sensationalizing it. When the day came, he dressed simply in a dark blazer and slacks, making sure his military medals were pinned neatly to his chest. As he walked into the studio, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, but Daniel remained calm, focusing on why he was there. During the interview, Daniel spoke clearly and honestly. He described the events at the gas station, explaining how the officer's actions had made him feel disrespected and unsafe. But he didn't stop there. Instead of dwelling on anger, he talked about the bigger picture, the need for accountability and respect between law enforcement and the communities they served. "I'm not here to attack anyone," he said, looking directly into the camera. "I just want people to realize that this isn't about one bad day or one bad encounter. It's about patterns of behavior that hurt everyone involved. If we don't address these issues, nothing will change." The interview resonated deeply with viewers. Many saw Daniel not just as a victim, but as someone committed to finding solutions. His words inspired conversations in homes, workplaces, and classrooms. Teachers used clips from the interview to spark discussions about racism and authority. Activists shared his message on social media, urging their followers to demand reform. Back in Maplewood, the pressure on the police department continued to mount. Chief Parks announced an internal investigation into the officer's conduct, promising transparency and fairness. However, not everyone trusted the process. Critics argued that departments often protected their own, no matter how egregious the misconduct. To ease concerns, Parks brought in an independent investigator, a retired judge named Margaret Ellis, to oversee the inquiry. As the investigation began, witnesses from the gas station came forward to share their accounts. The young mother who had been refueling her minivan described feeling terrified as she watched the confrontation unfold. "It was so unnecessary," she told investigators. "That poor man didn't do anything wrong." The elderly man on the bench recounted how tense the atmosphere had become, noting that the officers seemed determined to provoke Daniel rather than resolve the situation peacefully. The viral video provided undeniable evidence of the officer's behavior, leaving little room for denial. Still, Frank, Kyle, and Laura refused to take responsibility. During questioning, Frank doubled down on his actions, insisting he had been justified in stopping Daniel. "He looked suspicious," Frank claimed, though he struggled to explain why. "We're trained to trust our instincts." Kyle attempted to shift blame, suggesting he had simply followed orders. "Frank told me to back him up," he said defensively. "What was I supposed to do?" Laura remained tight-lipped throughout her interview, offering only vague responses when pressed for details. Tensions within the police department grew as the investigation dragged on. Some officers privately criticized Frank, Kyle, and Laura, believing their behavior reflected poorly on the entire force. Others defended them, arguing that public scrutiny was unfair and that the officers were being scapegoated. Conversations in the break room turned heated, with voices raised and tempers flaring. Outside the station, protests continued. Each night, demonstrators lit candles and held vigils, keeping the issue alive in the public consciousness. Local leaders joined the movement, speaking at rallies and calling for systemic changes. Even some members of the police department attended, listening quietly as speakers shared stories of mistreatment and discrimination. For Daniel, the whirlwind of attention was overwhelming but also motivating. He realized that his experience had struck a chord with many people who felt powerless against injustice. Encouraged by Michelle, he decided to use his platform to advocate for meaningful change. Together, they started reaching out to organizations focused on police reform and community relations, eager to learn more about how they could contribute. One group, called Unity Bridge, caught their attention. Founded by a former police officer named Chris Harper, the organization worked to build trust between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Chris invited Daniel and Michelle to attend one of their meetings, where they discussed strategies for fostering dialogue and accountability. At the meeting, Daniel listened intently as participants shared their experiences. A young woman named Maria spoke about how she had been pulled over multiple times for no apparent reason. An older man named Harold described being profiled at stores and restaurants. Their stories reinforced Daniel's belief that systemic issues needed addressing, not just individual cases of misconduct. Inspired by what he heard, Daniel began collaborating with Unity Bridge. He participated in workshops, gave speeches, and helped organize events aimed at bringing people together. Slowly but surely, he started to see glimpses of hope. Officers who attended the workshops admitted they hadn't fully understood the impact of their actions until hearing personal stories. Community members expressed gratitude for having a space to voice their concerns without fear of retaliation. Despite the progress, Daniel knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. Change rarely came quickly, especially when deeply ingrained attitudes were involved. But he was determined to keep pushing forward, guided by the belief that even small steps could lead to lasting impact. As weeks turned into months, life in Maplewood began to shift. The protests outside the police station dwindled, replaced by quieter efforts to rebuild trust. Conversations that once seemed impossible became more common. And though challenges remained, there was a growing sense that the town was moving in the right direction. For Daniel, the journey was far from over. He still carried the memory of that night at the gas station, a reminder of how fragile trust could be. But he also carried something else, a renewed sense of purpose. By standing up and speaking out, he had sparked a movement that extended far beyond himself. And in doing so, he had proven that courage and resilience could light the way toward a better future. The internal investigation into the actions of Frank Miller, Kyle Dawson, and Laura Bennett dragged on for weeks. Each day brought new developments, and the tension in Maplewood grew thicker. Chief Alan Parks felt the pressure mounting from all sides. Protesters outside the station, reporters calling constantly, and even his own officers divided over the case. Some believed the three should face consequences, while others thought they were being unfairly targeted. Margaret Ellis, the retired judge overseeing the investigation, worked tirelessly to gather evidence. She interviewed witnesses, reviewed the viral video frame by frame, and studied police protocols to determine whether the officers had acted appropriately. Her reputation for fairness gave her credibility, but it also meant she couldn't rush the process. Every detail mattered, and she knew her findings would have far-reaching consequences. Frank, Kyle, and Laura were suspended with pay during the investigation, though none of them seemed particularly bothered by it. Frank spent most of his time at home, ranting to anyone who would listen about how the system was rigged against law enforcement. "They're trying to destroy us," he told his wife one evening, pacing back and forth in their living room. "We're just doing our jobs, and now we're the bad guys." Kyle avoided talking about the incident altogether. Instead, he buried himself in video games and junk food, pretending the world outside didn't exist. His younger sister tried to reason with him once, pointing out that what he'd done looked wrong to everyone else. "You think I wanted this?" Kyle snapped, throwing down his controller. "I was just following orders. It's not like I made those decisions." Laura, meanwhile, kept her thoughts to herself. She rarely spoke about the case, even to her closest friends. When asked, she simply shrugged and said, "It is what it is." But late at night, when no one was around, she replayed the events in her mind, wondering if she could have handled things differently. Deep down, she felt uneasy, though she refused to admit it to anyone. As the investigation progressed, more details emerged that painted a clearer picture of what had happened. Witnesses described how hostile Frank had been from the start, how Kyle had joined in with mocking comments, and how Laura's decision to point her gun at Daniel had escalated the situation unnecessarily. Margaret Ellis noted these accounts, carefully cross-referencing them with the video footage and official reports. Meanwhile, life in Maplewood continued to change. The protests outside the police station became less frequent, but the community remained vocal. Local leaders organized town hall meetings where residents could voice their concerns directly to officials. These gatherings were often emotional, with people sharing painful stories of discrimination and mistreatment. Some attendees cried openly, while others expressed frustration that nothing seemed to improve despite years of complaints. Daniel Carter attended several of these meetings, listening quietly as others spoke. He didn't always agree with everything said, but he appreciated the opportunity for dialogue. After one particularly heated session, a young woman approached him. Her name was Emily, and she worked at a coffee shop downtown. "Thank you for standing up," she said softly. "I've been scared to speak out, but hearing your story gives me hope." Daniel smiled warmly. "You don't have to be scared," he replied. "Your voice matters too. We can only fix things if we work together." Encouraged by the growing momentum, Daniel decided to take a more active role in advocating for reform. With Michelle's support, he partnered with Unity Bridge, the organization founded by Chris Harper. Together, they launched a series of workshops designed to foster understanding between police officers and community members. These sessions weren't easy. There were moments of tension and disagreement, but they also created opportunities for connection. At one workshop, Daniel sat across from Officer Greg Monroe, a veteran cop who had initially dismissed the calls for reform. "I used to think this was all about politics," Greg admitted during a break, "but hearing your story made me realize there's more to it. I don't want to be part of the problem." Daniel nodded, appreciating the honesty. "It's not about blaming anyone," he said. "It's about learning and growing. If we can understand each other better, maybe we can prevent situations like mine from happening again." While progress was slow, small victories began to emerge. Officers who participated in the workshops started implementing changes in their daily routines, such as taking extra time to explain procedures to citizens or apologizing when misunderstandings occurred. Community members in turn expressed gratitude for these efforts, acknowledging that building trust required patience from both sides. Back at the police department, Chief Parks prepared to release the findings of the investigation. Margaret Ellis had submitted her report, detailing the officer's misconduct and recommending disciplinary action. Parks read through it carefully, knowing the decision would be controversial no matter what he chose. In the end, he decided to follow her recommendations fully. On a crisp autumn morning, Parks held a press conference to announce the results. Standing behind a podium surrounded by microphones, he cleared his throat and began speaking. After a thorough investigation, it has been determined that Officers Frank Miller, Kyle Dawson, and Laura Bennett violated department policies and demonstrated conduct unbecoming of their positions. As a result, they have been terminated from the force. The announcement sent shockwaves through Maplewood. Supporters of the officers gathered outside the station, holding signs that read "Back the Blue" and accusing the department of bowing to public pressure. Meanwhile, protesters cheered the decision, celebrating it as a victory for accountability. Social media lit up with reactions, ranging from praise for the outcome to skepticism about whether real change would follow. For Daniel, the news brought mixed emotions. On one hand, he felt relief that justice had been served, at least in this instance. On the other hand, he knew the fight was far from over. Terminating 3 officers wouldn't solve the deeper issues plaguing law enforcement. Still, he saw the decision as a step in the right direction. That evening, Daniel and Michelle sat together on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "It's something," Michelle said softly, breaking the silence. "Not everything, but something." Daniel nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, it's a start. And maybe, just maybe, it'll inspire others to keep pushing for change." Over the next few weeks, the spotlight on Maplewood began to dim. National media moved on to other stories, and life in the town gradually returned to its usual rhythm. But the impact of the incident lingered. Conversations about race, authority, and accountability continued, albeit in quieter ways. Teachers incorporated discussions about systemic racism into their lesson plans. Parents talked to their children about treating others with respect, regardless of differences. For Frank, Kyle, and Laura, life after termination proved challenging. None of them found new jobs easily, and their reputations suffered. Frank struggled to adjust, lashing out at anyone who criticized him. Kyle withdrew further into isolation, spending hours scrolling through social media and reading angry comments directed at him. Laura, however, quietly enrolled in counseling, hoping to make sense of her feelings and reflect on her choices. At the same time, Daniel's advocacy work gained traction. He traveled to nearby cities, giving speeches and participating in panel discussions about police reform. People admired his ability to remain calm and composed, even when discussing difficult topics. His message resonated with many, inspiring them to take action in their own communities. One afternoon, Daniel received an email from a high school student named Jake. "Hi, Major Carter," the message read. "I saw you speak last week and it really inspired me. I'm working on a project about racial injustice, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to answer a few questions." Daniel smiled as he read the note. This was why he kept going, to show people that change was possible, even in the face of adversity. He typed out a response inviting Jake to call him whenever he was ready. As days turned into weeks, Daniel realized that his journey wasn't just about seeking justice for himself. It was about creating a ripple effect, a chain reaction of awareness, empathy, and action. Though challenges remained, he felt hopeful. Hopeful that someday towns like Maplewood wouldn't need protests or investigations to remind them of the importance of respect and fairness. Hopeful that future generations would grow up in a world where incidents like the one he experienced became rare exceptions, rather than common occurrences. And so, with determination in his heart and purpose in his steps, Daniel continued forward, ready to face whatever came next. The dismissal of Frank Miller, Kyle Dawson, and Laura Bennett marked a turning point for Maplewood, but it also opened the door to new challenges. While many celebrated the decision as a victory for accountability, others saw it as an attack on law enforcement. The town became a battleground of opinions, with emotions running high on both sides. Some residents praised Daniel Carter for his courage, while others accused him of stirring up trouble. Despite the mixed reactions, Daniel remained focused on his mission to create meaningful change. In the weeks following the officer's termination, Daniel noticed subtle shifts in the community. People who had once avoided discussing sensitive topics like racism and police misconduct now spoke openly about them. Conversations that used to happen only behind closed doors spilled into public spaces, coffee shops, grocery stores, and even playgrounds. Teachers began addressing these issues in classrooms, encouraging students to think critically about fairness and equality. Parents talked to their children about treating everyone with respect, regardless of race or background. But not everyone was ready to embrace change. Supporters of Frank, Kyle, and Laura organized counter-protests, holding signs that read, "Protect our police," and "Stop attacking law enforcement." They argued that the officers were being unfairly punished and that the system was targeting cops instead of supporting them. These protests sometimes turned tense, with shouting matches breaking out between opposing groups. Officers still working at the police department found themselves caught in the middle, unsure whether to side with their former colleagues or support the growing calls for reform. Chief Alan Park struggled to maintain order within the force. Morale among the officers was low, and trust between the department and the community remained fragile. To address these issues, Parks announced a series of initiatives aimed at rebuilding relationships. He introduced mandatory bias training for all officers, hired a civilian oversight committee to review complaints against the department, and implemented stricter accountability measures for misconduct. While some officers welcomed these changes, others resisted, claiming they were unnecessary and burdensome. Despite the resistance, small victories began to emerge. Officers who participated in the bias training reported gaining a better understanding of how their actions could affect others. One officer, Sarah Jenkins, shared her experience during a community meeting. "At first, I thought this training was a waste of time," she admitted. "But then I realized how much I didn't know. It made me think twice about how I interact with people, especially those who might feel intimidated by me because of my uniform." Community members appreciated these efforts, though many remained cautious. "It's a start," said Harold Johnson, an elderly man who had spoken at earlier protests. "But we've heard promises before. We need to see real results." Daniel continued to play a key role in fostering dialogue between the police and the community. Through Unity Bridge, he helped organize monthly forums where citizens and officers could come together to share their experiences and concerns. These meetings weren't always easy. There were moments of tension with participants raising their voices and challenging each other's perspectives. But there were also breakthroughs, moments when someone listened, really listened, and walked away with a new understanding. One such moment happened during a forum attended by Officer Greg Monroe. A young woman named Maria stood up and described how she had been pulled over multiple times for no apparent reason. "I felt humiliated," she said, her voice trembling, "like I wasn't worth anything more than suspicion." Greg listened, quietly, his expression thoughtful. When it was his turn to speak, he apologized, not just to Maria, but to everyone in the room. "I can't undo what's been done," he said, "but I want you to know that I'm listening, and I promise to do better." Maria nodded, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means a lot." These kinds of exchanges gave Daniel hope. He knew that building trust would take time, but he believed that every positive interaction brought the community one step closer to healing. Encouraged by the progress, he decided to expand his advocacy work beyond Maplewood. With Michelle's help, he started traveling to nearby towns, sharing his story and offering guidance to communities facing similar challenges. During one of these trips, Daniel visited a city called Ridgewood, where tensions between residents and police had reached a boiling point. Protesters filled the streets demanding justice after a teenager was shot by an officer during a traffic stop. The situation was volatile, with both sides refusing to back down. Local leaders invited Daniel to speak at a town hall meeting, hoping his perspective might help bridge the divide. When Daniel took the stage, the room fell silent. He began by acknowledging the pain and anger in the room. "I know how it feels, to be treated unfairly," he said, "to feel like your voice doesn't matter. But I also know that staying silent won't solve anything. If we want change, we have to talk to each other, even when it's hard." His words resonated with the audience. Afterward, people lined up to thank him, shaking his hand and sharing their own stories. One man, a father named Richard, approached Daniel with tears in his eyes. "My son was the one who got shot," he said. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive what happened, but hearing you today, it gives me hope that maybe things can get better." Daniel placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. "I'm so sorry for your loss," he said, "and I can't promise that everything will be okay. But I believe that if we keep pushing for change, we can make a difference." As Daniel traveled from town to town, he realized that his story had struck a chord with people across the country. Strangers wrote to him, thanking him for speaking out and sharing how his courage had inspired them to take action in their own lives. Some started petitions calling for policy reforms. Others organized rallies or joined local advocacy groups. Each message reminded Daniel that he wasn't alone in this fight. Back in Maplewood, life slowly began to stabilize. The protests died down, replaced by quieter efforts to rebuild trust. Officers who had initially resisted the new initiatives started embracing them, recognizing the value of connecting with the community. Residents, too, made an effort to engage with law enforcement, attending meetings and volunteering for programs aimed at fostering mutual understanding. Even Chief Parks noticed a shift in the atmosphere. "We're not perfect," he admitted during a press conference, "but we're trying, and that's what matters." For Daniel, the journey was far from over. Though the immediate crisis in Maplewood had passed, he knew that systemic issues persisted. Racism and discrimination weren't problems that could be solved overnight. They required constant attention, effort, and commitment. Still, he felt hopeful. Every conversation, every workshop, every handshake brought the community one step closer to a brighter future. One evening, as Daniel sat on his porch with Michelle, he reflected on everything that had happened. The incident at the gas station had changed his life in ways he never expected. It had forced him to confront painful truths about society and himself. But it had also given him a purpose, a reason to keep fighting for justice and equality. "You've done so much already," Michelle said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever feel like taking a break?" Daniel smiled softly. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I think about all the people counting on us, the kids who deserve to grow up in a fairer world, the families who've been hurt by injustice. I can't stop now." Michelle squeezed his hand. "Then we'll keep going together." And so, with determination in his heart and hope in his eyes, Daniel prepared for the road ahead. He knew there would be obstacles, moments of doubt, setbacks, and resistance. But he also knew that every step forward mattered. Together with Michelle, his community, and countless others inspired by his journey, he vowed to continue pushing for a world where everyone was treated with dignity and respect. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over Maplewood, Daniel felt a sense of peace. The path ahead was uncertain, but he was ready to face whatever came next. For him, the fight wasn't just about seeking justice. It was about creating a legacy of compassion, understanding, and unity. And in that mission, he found endless strength. Months had passed since the dismissal of Frank Miller, Kyle Dawson, and Laura Bennett, and Maplewood was slowly finding its footing. The protests had quieted, but the conversations they sparked continued to ripple through the town. People were talking, really talking, about the issues that divided them. For Daniel Carter, this shift was both encouraging and exhausting. He had become a symbol of resilience and change, but the weight of expectations sometimes felt overwhelming. Daniel decided to take a short leave from his military duties to focus entirely on his advocacy work. His superiors understood the importance of what he was doing and granted him permission, knowing that his efforts could inspire positive change far beyond Maplewood. With Michelle by his side, Daniel threw himself into organizing workshops, speaking engagements, and community forums. They traveled across the country, visiting towns and cities where tensions between law enforcement and residents were high. In one such town, called Brookfield, Daniel met a group of teenagers who had formed their own initiative called Youth for Unity. These young people were determined to make a difference in their community, despite facing skepticism from adults who doubted their ability to create real change. When Daniel arrived to speak at their event, he was struck by their passion and determination. "Major Carter," said one of the teens, a girl named Anna, "we've been working hard to bring people together, but it's tough. Some cops won't even listen to us. How do we get them to care?" Daniel thought for a moment before answering. "It starts with patience," he said. "Change doesn't happen overnight. You have to keep showing up, keep having conversations, even when it feels like no one's listening. Sometimes all it takes is one person to hear you and decide to act differently." Anna nodded, her eyes bright with renewed hope. "Thank you," she said. "That means a lot." These interactions reminded Daniel why he kept going. It wasn't just about addressing systemic issues. It was about empowering others to believe in their ability to make a difference. Everywhere he went, he saw sparks of hope. Small groups of people coming together to challenge injustice and build bridges. Back in Maplewood, Chief Alan Parks continued implementing reforms within the police department. The mandatory bias training had evolved into ongoing education sessions, where officers learned not only about racial sensitivity, but also about de-escalation techniques and cultural awareness. The Civilian Oversight Committee proved to be a valuable addition, providing an outside perspective on complaints against officers and helping rebuild trust with the community. One officer, Sarah Jenkins, emerged as a leader in these efforts. After attending several workshops led by Daniel, she began volunteering her time to mentor younger officers. "We can't afford to keep making the same mistakes," she told her colleagues. "If we want to earn the public's trust, we need to show them that we're willing to learn and grow." Sarah's dedication inspired others in the department to follow her lead. Slowly but surely, the culture within the force began to shift. Officers started taking pride in building relationships with residents rather than viewing them as adversaries. Community members noticed the change too. Parents felt more comfortable letting their children interact with police officers during school visits or neighborhood events. Business owners reported fewer misunderstandings during routine checks. It was progress, not perfect, but meaningful. Despite these strides, challenges remained. Not everyone in Maplewood supported the reforms. Some residents still believed the officers were being unfairly targeted, while others felt the changes weren't happening fast enough. Tensions occasionally flared, especially when incidents involving law enforcement made national headlines. But Daniel encouraged people to stay focused on their goals. "We're not going to fix everything at once," he told a crowd during a town hall meeting. "But every step forward counts. Every conversation matters. Don't let frustration stop you from doing the work." His words resonated with many, including Emily Harper, Chris Harper's daughter, who had recently joined Unity Bridge. Emily admired Daniel's unwavering optimism and wanted to contribute to the cause in her own way. She began documenting stories of individuals affected by police misconduct, creating videos and podcasts that highlighted their experiences. Her project gained traction online, drawing attention to the human side of the issue and fostering empathy among viewers. Meanwhile, Daniel and Michelle collaborated with local schools to develop programs aimed at teaching students about civic responsibility and social justice. They worked closely with teachers to create lesson plans that encouraged critical thinking and empathy. One day, after giving a presentation to a group of high school seniors, Daniel received a letter from a student named Jake, the same boy who had emailed him months earlier. "Dear Major Carter," Jake wrote, "thank you for inspiring me to speak up. Your story showed me that one person can make a difference no matter how hard things seem. I'm planning to study criminal justice in college so I can help reform the system from the inside. Thank you for believing in us." Reading the letter brought tears to Daniel's eyes. He realized that his work wasn't just about changing policies or holding bad actors accountable. It was about planting seeds of hope in the next generation. Each young person who chose to stand up for justice was proof that his efforts were worth it. As winter approached, Daniel and Michelle returned to Maplewood to spend the holidays with family. The town looked different now, calmer, yet full of purpose. Decorations adorned the streets and festive lights twinkled in shop windows. At the annual holiday market, Daniel ran into Officer Greg Monroe, who greeted him warmly. "I heard you've been traveling a lot," Greg said. "How's it going out there?" "It's going well," Daniel replied with a smile. "People are ready to listen. They want to do better. What about here? How's the department holding up?" Greg shrugged. "It's not easy, but we're getting there. The new policies are helping and the community seems to notice. We've still got a long way to go, though." "That's true," Daniel agreed. "But you're moving in the right direction. That's what matters." Later that evening, as snow began to fall softly over Maplewood, Daniel sat by the fireplace with Michelle. He reflected on how much had changed since the night at the gas station. The incident had tested him in ways he never imagined, but it had also given him a deeper sense of purpose. "You've done incredible work," Michelle said, breaking the silence. "Do you ever think about slowing down?" Daniel chuckled softly. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I remember all the people counting on us. If we stop now, what message does that send? We've come too far to give up." Michelle smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Then we'll keep going. Together." And so, with renewed energy and determination, Daniel prepared for the year ahead. He knew the road wouldn't always be smooth, but he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. For him, the fight wasn't just about seeking justice, it was about creating a world where everyone could live with dignity and respect. And in that mission, he found endless strength. As the fire crackled and the snow blanketed the town, Daniel felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the support of his family, for the courage of those standing beside him, and for the opportunity to make a difference. He didn't know what the future held, but he was certain of one thing. As long as there were people willing to fight for fairness and equality, there was hope. And hope, he believed, was the most powerful force of all. The months turned into a year since the incident at the gas station, and Maplewood felt like a different place. The town wasn't perfect, far from it, but there was a sense of progress in the air. People talked more openly about issues that had once been swept under the rug. Conversations about race, respect, and accountability became a regular part of life, whether at dinner tables, school meetings, or community gatherings. For Daniel Carter, this shift was proof that his efforts were making a difference, even if the journey was far from over. Daniel returned to active duty with the U.S. Army, balancing his military responsibilities with his advocacy work. Though he couldn't travel as much as before, he stayed connected to the movement through video, calls, emails, and occasional visits to towns where he had previously spoken. His story continued to inspire others, and people often reached out to share how his words had motivated them to take action in their own lives. One day, while stationed at a base in Texas, Daniel received an invitation to speak at a national conference on police reform. The event brought together law enforcement officials, activists, policymakers, and community leaders from across the country. It was a chance for Daniel to address a wider audience and share the lessons he had learned over the past year. When Daniel took the stage, the room fell silent. He began by thanking everyone for their commitment to creating change. "This isn't just my fight," he said. "It's all of ours. None of us can do it alone, but together we can make a difference." He spoke about the importance of listening, not just hearing words, but truly understanding the experiences of others. He shared stories from his travels, highlighting moments when empathy and dialogue had bridged divides. "Change starts with small steps," he explained. "A conversation here, a policy change there. Each step matters." After his speech, dozens of attendees approached him to express their gratitude. One woman, a police chief from a nearby city, told Daniel how his message had inspired her to implement similar reforms in her department. "You've given me hope," she said. "I didn't think it was possible to rebuild trust, but now I see that it is." Back in Maplewood, life continued to improve. The police department had become a model for other towns looking to adopt reform measures. Chief Alan Parks frequently fielded calls from fellow chiefs seeking advice on implementing bias training, civilian oversight committees, and accountability protocols. Officers like Sarah Jenkins and Greg Monroe served as ambassadors for the program, sharing their experiences at regional conferences and workshops. Community members noticed the changes too. Parents felt safer allowing their children to interact with officers during school visits or neighborhood patrols. Business owners reported fewer misunderstandings during routine checks. Even casual interactions, like chatting with an officer at the grocery store, felt less tense than they used to. But not everyone was satisfied. Some residents still believed the reforms didn't go far enough, arguing that deeper structural changes were needed. Others criticized the pace of progress, saying it was too slow. Daniel understood these frustrations. He knew that systemic issues couldn't be solved overnight, but he also recognized the importance of acknowledging every victory, no matter how small. One evening, as Daniel walked through Maplewoods Park, he ran into Harold Johnson, the elderly man who had spoken at protests months earlier. Harold smiled warmly and shook Daniel's hand. "Things are better," he said. "Not perfect, but better. You should be proud of what you've done." Daniel nodded, appreciating the sentiment. "We're not done yet," he replied. "But I'm hopeful. That's something, isn't it?" Harold chuckled. "Hope is everything. Without it, we'd have nothing." As winter approached, Daniel and Michelle hosted a small gathering at their home to celebrate the progress made over the past year. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues came together to share food, stories, and laughter. Among the guests were Officers Sarah Jenkins and Chris Harper, founder of Unity Bridge, both of whom had played key roles in fostering positive change. During the evening, Chris stood up to say a few words. "When I started Unity Bridge, I hoped it would help bring people together," he began. "But I never imagined we'd see the kind of impact we've seen in Maplewood. This town has shown that change is possible when people are willing to listen and work together. And none of it would have happened without Daniel and Michelle's leadership." The room erupted in applause, and Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't set out to be a leader. He had simply wanted to stand up for what was right. But seeing the ripple effects of his actions filled him with pride and a renewed determination to keep going. Later that night, as the guests left and the house grew quiet, Daniel sat by the window with Michelle. Snowflakes drifted gently from the sky, blanketing the town in white. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that night at the gas station had gone differently?" Michelle asked softly. Daniel thought for a moment. Sometimes, he admitted. But I think about all the good that's come from it. The conversations, the connections, the changes. Maybe it had to happen this way for people to wake up. Michelle smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. You've changed so many lives, Daniel, including mine. Daniel wrapped an arm around her, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would still be setbacks, disagreements, and moments of doubt. But he also knew that as long as people kept showing up, kept talking, and kept believing in the possibility of change, progress would continue. In the weeks that followed, Daniel returned to his military duties with a renewed sense of purpose. His experience in Maplewood had taught him that leadership wasn't about titles or authority. It was about inspiring others to act with integrity and compassion. On the base, he became a mentor to younger soldiers, teaching them not only tactical skills but also the importance of empathy and accountability. At the same time, Michelle continued her work with Unity Bridge, helping expand its reach to new communities. Together, they remained committed to the cause, knowing that their efforts would leave a lasting legacy. Back in Maplewood, the town carried on its journey toward healing. The police department held monthly forums where residents could voice concerns and offer suggestions. Schools incorporated lessons on social justice into their curriculums, encouraging students to think critically about fairness and equality. Local businesses partnered with community organizations to sponsor events promoting unity and understanding. For Daniel, the greatest reward was seeing how ordinary people stepped up to make extraordinary changes. Whether it was a teenager organizing a march, a teacher leading classroom discussions, or an officer volunteering for outreach programs, each person played a role in shaping a brighter future. As another year drew to a close, Daniel reflected on how far they had come. The incident at the gas station had been a painful chapter in his life, but it had also sparked a movement that extended far beyond Maplewood. Through courage, resilience, and collaboration, a community had come together to confront injustice and build bridges. On New Year's Eve, Daniel and Michelle stood on their porch watching fireworks light up the sky. The town was quiet, peaceful, yet full of promise. "Here's to another year of hope," Michelle said, raising a glass. Daniel smiled, clinking his glass against hers, and to all the people who refused to give up. As the clock struck midnight, marking the start of a new year, Daniel felt a profound sense of optimism. The fight for justice and equality was far from over, but he knew they were moving in the right direction. Together, step by step, they were creating a world where everyone could live with dignity and respect, a world worth fighting for.